The 1904 Olympic Games in St. Louis were supposed to celebrate human endurance, strength, and glory. What they delivered instead was one of the most chaotic, unbelievable, and darkly funny sporting events in history. The marathon that nearly killed half its runners, embarrassed an entire nation, and forever changed the rules of the Olympics. The day was August 30th, 1904. The air over Missouri shimmered with heat. It was over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity made it feel like running through soup. Dust hung in the air from miles of unpaved roads. The marathon would be run over 24.85 miles of twisting, hilly terrain through country roads used mostly by wagons and livestock. There were no water stations, not because the organizers forgot, but because they thought dehydration might be a good experiment. At the time, sports medicine was practically guesswork. The chief organizer of the Olympic marathon, James Sullivan, wanted to study the limits of human endurance. So he arranged only one water stop, a dusty well at mile 11. He wanted to test how much strain the body could take without hydration. The runners didn't know they were about to become lab rats in one of history's strangest scientific trials. 32 men lined up at the starting line. Among them were Americans, South Africans, Cubans, and a handful of Europeans. Some wore proper running shoes. Others, like the South African competitors, ran barefoot. Spectators cheered as the pistol fired, and almost immediately, chaos began. Within the first mile, the runners were coughing from dust kicked up by the officials' cars driving ahead of them. The vehicles were supposed to clear the way, but instead, they choked the runners in clouds of brown grit so thick they could barely see. One competitor, William Garcia, inhaled so much dust that he collapsed by the roadside, coughing up blood. He was found barely alive, his lungs coated in dirt. Doctors said he was minutes from bleeding to death. Meanwhile, other runners took wrong turns because the course wasn't clearly marked. Some chased wagons. One man, John Lorden, vomited repeatedly and quit early. Another, Len Tao from South Africa, was chased off the road by a pack of wild dogs and had to run nearly a mile into a cornfield to escape. By the time he returned, the race was lost. And then came the first winner. A runner named Fred Lors, an American bricklayer, was among the front pack early on. But after 9 miles, he collapsed from exhaustion. His coach put him in a car to drive back to the stadium. After getting a ride for nearly 11 miles, the car broke down. Feeling somewhat recovered, Lors decided to jog the last few miles back into the stadium. When the crowd saw him enter first, they erupted in cheers. An American wins! Cameras flashed, the U.S. flag was raised, and Lors even began his victory lap. President Roosevelt's daughter, Alice, was about to place a gold medal around his neck when a witness shouted, "He rode in a car!" The crowd gasped. Officials confronted him, and Lors sheepishly admitted the truth. He was just joking. The joke nearly got him banned for life. But the real winner was even stranger. A small, wiry man named Thomas Hicks was still staggering along the road supported by 2 trainers. He was in agony, hallucinating from heat and exhaustion. His trainers, desperate to keep him moving, began feeding him strychnine, a poison used to kill rats, mixed with brandy. Back then, strychnine in small doses was believed to act as a stimulant. Hicks gulped it down. As he stumbled onward, his body began to fail. He begged for water, but his trainers only sponged his mouth with distilled water, not letting him drink. His skin turned ashen. He started muttering nonsense and waving at imaginary people. Every few miles, they gave him another shot of brandy and another pinch of poison. When he reached the stadium, his legs buckled. He was half carried across the finish line, his feet barely touching the ground. Officials declared him the winner, even though he looked like a ghost. He had lost 8 pounds during the race, and nearly his life. The crowd cheered anyway. America had won. Hicks, barely conscious, whispered, "Never again." He had to be carried to the medical tent where he nearly died of poisoning and dehydration. Meanwhile, back on the course, another runner was making headlines for very different reasons. His name was Felix de la Caridad Carvajal y del Monte, or simply Felix Carvajal, a mailman from Havana, Cuba. He had raised money for the trip by running exhibitions through his hometown, but he lost most of his savings gambling in New Orleans on his way to St. Louis. He arrived at the marathon wearing long trousers, a white shirt, and street shoes. Another runner took pity on him and cut his pants into makeshift shorts. Felix was a natural entertainer. He waved at spectators, joked with runners, and stopped several times along the course to chat with onlookers. At one point, he wandered into an orchard, plucked some apples, and ate them. Unfortunately, they were rotten. Felix doubled over in pain, laughing and clutching his stomach, before lying down under a tree for a nap. After resting, he got up and kept running, still smiling. Despite all of this, he finished in 4th place. When the race finally ended, only 14 of the 32 runners finished. Nearly half had collapsed from exhaustion, heat stroke, or injury. One was hospitalized for weeks. The event was so disastrous that Olympic officials immediately reconsidered how marathons should be run. Hicks's victory became both famous and infamous. He was hailed as a hero, but the controversy over doping and dehydration led to new medical standards for competition. It also marked the last time a major race would be held without adequate water supplies. Sullivan's experiment on human endurance had nearly killed a dozen men. Historians still argue whether the 1904 Olympic marathon was comedy or tragedy. It was both. The runners who survived became legends, not because of athletic glory, but because they lived through an absurd endurance test no one should have ever faced. There were no modern rules, no sports drinks, no fair play, just stubbornness, dust, and sheer human insanity. Years later, reporters would look back and call it the most ridiculous sporting event ever staged. The marathon that had been meant to symbolize human triumph over distance instead became a warning about arrogance, bad science, and the thin line between determination and foolishness. But for all its chaos, the race left a legacy. It forced the Olympics to standardize the marathon distance and to treat athletes as people, not experiments. It taught the world what exhaustion truly looks like. A man staggering over the finish line, delirious and poisoned, cheered by a crowd that didn't yet understand what they were witnessing. Thomas Hicks survived and retired soon after. Fred Lors was eventually forgiven and went on to win the Boston Marathon the next year, for real, on foot. Felix Carvajal returned to Cuba and was celebrated as a folk hero, remembered for his charm and his smile in the face of disaster. And so the 1904 Olympic Marathon became more than a race. It became a legend, a dusty, absurd, half-forgotten story about the limits of the human body and the even stranger limits of human judgment. It was proof that sometimes the greatest Olympic moments aren't about victory at all. They're about survival.